The life of Howard Hughes is the stuff of legend. He was a pioneer in developing faster and faster airplanes. He inherited a lot of money. He went to Hollywood. He dated a lot of attractive women. He was friends of many people. His early love was planes. There's a new movie called The Aviator, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. And here's the trailer from the film.
Howard Hughes.
I care very much about aviation. Fastest man on the planet.
Oh, marvelous.
He saw the future.
I'm not gonna believe this. Howard Hughes has bought TWA.
Let's build a plane that flies above the weather.
Across the country, across the world.
If you do that, you could lose everything.
Well, I won't.
He lived the dream.
Welcome to Hollywood.
I feel like a little adventure, Miss Hepburn.
Do your worst, Mr. Hughes.
I have heard some disquieting rumors about Mr. Hughes. I'd like to know everything there is to know.
See, I want to learn what pleases you.
Howard, you madman.
He thought nothing could stop him.
You have to be very careful.
My investigators have turned up a lot of dirt.
You want to go to war with me? You know, sometimes I get these crazy ideas about things that may not really be there.
I'll have him dragged here to Washington. I want to see the whites of his life.
We are in a street fight, and I'm not going to lose. He owns Pan Am, he owns Congress, but he does not own the sky.
Beyond the wealth,
You want me to bribe senators?
I don't want them bribed, Jack. I want them bought.
something drove him
You have called me a liar and a thief and a war prophecy.
beyond the legend.
Federal warrant.
Everything in these offices is the private property of Hughes Productions.
Something consumed him
They are touchy things.
beyond the genius.
The deadline is now completely unrealistic.
No, I want to see the blueprints again. Show me all the blueprints. Show me all the blueprints. Show me all the blueprints.
Is the truth behind the man.
I'll get a doctor. No one sees him like this.
Sometimes I truly fear that I'm losing my mind.
There's nothing there, Howard.
Will you marry me?
You're too crazy for me.
She'll go faster.
The Aviator.
Joining me now is the film's director, Martin Scorsese, and one of the stars, Cate Blanchett. She plays another famous Cate in the film, Katharine Hepburn. I am pleased to have them back at this table to talk about a film and a man who inspired a film. Welcome. Great to see you.
Good to be here.
Yeah.
How did this come to you?
Well, I was finishing Gangs of New York. I was still in the editing process and looking for another picture because Gangs had been such a project of hauling in for 25 years or so, right. And I wanted something fresh and new that I hadn't, was not generated from me in a way.
Right.
And suddenly my manager, who happens to be Leo DiCaprio's manager too, says, I have something for you. I'm not going to tell you what it is. And they sent me the script, and I sat in my room and opened up the first page, and it says The Aviator. And right away, you know, I'm phobic about flying.
You don't like to fly.
I don't like to. I do it, but I don't like it. So
who likes to fly?
I really, really don't. But interesting, the word aviator, I hadn't really been associated. I really hadn't read that word in a long time. This seemed to be, it's out of use, the word aviator in a sense. Turn the page and start reading, and quite honestly, by the 12th page, I realized it's Howard Hughes shooting Hell's Angels, a picture which I like a lot and somewhat obsessed with. And first I got nervous. So it's Howard Hughes. I said, I know all these other projects about Howard Hughes have been going around for years. And Warren Beatty had one, and he's such an extraordinary filmmaker. Reds was so unique in its narrative, new way of telling a story, that you know, is something I should not get involved with here. But as I read, it revealed a Howard Hughes that I was not aware of. Really, I grew up I was born in '42, so I grew up in the late '40s, early '50s. I saw Howard Hughes' name on RKO Radio Pictures Presents, you know, and these very strange films that were made while he was the head of the studio, and then I just heard about him as a recluse and an eccentric,
sort of
and very
Vegas
rich
years,
man.
yeah.
The Las Vegas years does it in, and a man who had his hand seemingly into everything, kind of a shadowy figure, which was interesting to me. But there was so much talk in the 70s about doing films on him that I kind of pulled myself out. I didn't want to get too much into it. But what I didn't know was about the Howard Hughes as the young visionary, in a way, the idea of the Aviator, which, as you say, today would be what, an astronaut, in a sense. You know, the Charles Lindbergh period, Amelia Earhart, Wiley Post, people like that. The Aviator is a romantic figure, even in Jean Renoir's The Rules of the Game. The Aviator is a romantic figure. So all of this I really I didn't know about very much, and I was also taken by how he. I was not aware completely of how he built planes and what he did in shaping aviation as we now know it, and as we take it for granted today.
And how brilliant his conception of the different planes was.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
his belief in what was possible.
Yeah, and I'm obsessed with speed. Obsessed with just wanting to get away from the Earth, to be up in the clouds like a god, And the interesting thing to me was wanting to live like a god in the clouds. He also had the amount of he had unlimited cash. Yeah. Just like King Croesus, you know.
And then that paid for everything in the beginning, even though he wasn't making money in the movies.
Oh, yeah.
Before I go and talk about Katharine Hepburn, what was it about Hell's Angels?
Two things about Hell's Angels.
Was it Hell's Angels?
Hell's Angels and Scarface, two films that were, my father, who used to love movies, as he was a working-class guy at Garment District, and he took me to see a double bill of Public Enemy and Little Caesar in 1952. It was double re-release. And I fell in love with Public Enemy, the strongest, toughest gangster film ever made. William Wellman directed that. And then my father said, yeah, it's a wonderful film, but you have to see Scarface. Well, Scarface you couldn't see because apparently Hughes had kept Scarface and Hell's Angels in a vault somewhere, and thinking he was going to re-release it at some point in time. So I never really saw Scarface till the mid-70s, and I always wondered how, if I had seen Scarface along with Public Enemy, what would be the formative years for me? What would have happened with my pictures? But the other thing was he also mentioned Hell's Angels. He kept talking about Hell's Angels. You can never see Hell's Angels. I sneaked into a class of Bill Everson at NYU in the late 60s, and he had his 16mm print. And the dialogue scenes are a little creaky at times, but Jean Harlow is amazing. And the aerial sequence, even the aerial sequences, even on a small screen, you can see there's nothing had been done like it. Even Wings. William Wellman was a flyer at the Lafayette Escadrille. He really was, and he was in a terrible crash, Wellman. But what Hughes was able to get in the air, 40 planes in the air, and what he did with these models and planes, to this day just can't be duplicated.
Well, you wouldn't be allowed to do it today. That's the extraordinary thing. I mean, there'd be I tried to shoot a photograph with Annie Leibovitz, me just sitting on a stationary plane, and some safety officer came and told me to get off it.
Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, everything's so safe.
And how did he meet, and what was his relationship with Hepburn?
Well, see, there you go. I mean, they were both such enigmas. I mean, everyone thinks they know Hepburn, but they know her screen persona. I think they were both immensely private. Yeah. And we trawled and trawled and trawled to try to find some, juicy detail about their relationship, and it just doesn't exist because it happened behind closed doors. And even though they were both, Hughes's celebrity was much greater at that stage than Hepburn. I mean, she was sort of on a rapid decline, having hit so early with Bill of Divorcement and Alice Adams. So, but not a lot.
There's a great scene where she takes him to meet her family in Connecticut.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's he's just, you sat there saying, why doesn't he walk out?
Well,
which he does.
He finally does,
does. But the point is that what? Was that a true scene that you have some reason to put that in there?
John Logan, the writer, John Logan, had approached the material of the picture. One of the reasons I wanted to do the film is it just was dealing with 20 years of Howard Hughes' life, from the age of 26 to 46, whatever, 1927 and 47. And part of that
his
was
glory years in terms of aviation and movies.
Really, and movies, yeah. And so there's no doubt that the relationship, I think, from what we've read and from what John put in the script, there's no doubt, I think, with his relationship to Katharine Hepburn and her family in Connecticut, that he did go to the place many times, and there was the ex-husband photographing him. We do have one little bit of film. It's less than a second long of Howard Hughes about to take a shot with a golf club, and he looks up and he looks at, and the camera stopped. It's probably Luddy taking the pictures,
and Luddy was her former husband.
A former husband, yeah. But I think what's interesting to me was that from what I understand too, he would get up and make phone calls for 4 hours, and that sort of those days you didn't do that in a family house, that sort of thing. But I also understand that the family was a very progressive family. Socially progressive, and were into women's suffrage and the turn of the century.
And what was his politics?
I think ultimately was extremely conservative.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Extremely.
Which would have been a bone of contention with the Hepburns.
Yes, exactly.
Now, did Hepburn write about Hughes much in her autobiography? In Me? Yeah, Me, yes.
It's a great title.
I don't know how much truth is in Me. I don't know. A little bit. The thing
because of what? She was just that person who would exaggerate everything?
No, I just think it's impossible to be objective about your life. And because I think she was quintessentially a private person, she was doing a very public thing because probably she felt she could, and it might buy her a bit of space, but I don't know that much was actually revealed in Me.
By her.
But what was interesting was her turn of phrase.
Which was?
The way she phrased things in Me, I think it was very much her voice. I think.
And how is it, here's somebody that a lot of us saw on television, the famous Dick Cavett interviews, of which there were more than one, in which she comes in, as you reminded me, and doesn't know the camera's on, and tell me what she did.
She was pushing the furniture around, and she was saying, I go this way, and she had to be shot from a certain side. She was incredibly demanding. But she really claimed her space, and what I found really moving about it was that she'd never done a television interview before. We just take it for, as a given that that's part of, advertising a film or, talking about your work. And she was really uncomfortable. And in watching, even as an older woman, it was the first time I'd really seen this vein of vulnerability in Hepburn, because I think prior to sort of watching her films, and also the fact that you screen them, Marty, you could actually see into her eyes and see the finesse of her performance, and that there was behind this sort of brash, confident, strident exterior, she was really quite fragile. And I think, often the most strident people do have that. So that I really saw that in watching her being uncomfortable, and where her tics lay and what part of her body she was uncomfortable with, and also just because she didn't know the camera was on in the beginning, what she focused on. Because I think the trap in playing someone like Hepburn, who's so known vocally and physically, would be to ignore the psychological change that one needs to make as an actor, and just purely go for the external.
What psychological change was that with her?
I think she was quite obsessive as well. I mean, I think I think probably there was a point of connection between the two of them, is that she was a control freak. But I think both of them, both she and Hughes were.
Why did she leave him?
I don't know. I mean, we talked a lot about them both. They're were very
was it just
ambitious
they realized
people.
they were just alike and couldn't live together?
Yeah, and which is what she says in Me, is that they were misfits and perhaps too alike. But I think they were very good friends, because they did stay in contact. And something which she did say was that that he would often ring her at 3 in the morning, and she'd hear this sort of silence and then a lonely voice, and she'd say, Howard, and then,
Howard?
So, I mean, they did stay in contact. So I think there was
and there's a great scene with Willem Dafoe, in which Hughes tells the guy who's going to expose the relationship with Spencer Tracy.
Try to cover up an old Confidential magazine routine.
And pretty much threatens the guy.
But he was always looking out for her as well. Like, it was on his advice that she optioned the screen rights to the play Philadelphia Story, so it couldn't be made without her. Because at that stage, she didn't have the power that she had, and she would not necessarily have been the studio's first choice.
Now, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. That younger people seeing this film today, or people who really don't know that much about Katharine Hepburn, we tend to think that she was always successful. Right. I saw her films I saw her films when I was growing up in the late 40s, early 50s. And when I saw the ones from the 1930s on TV, I always assumed that she was on a line of, there was never any problem. In a way, it was very interesting for us to, what I did was screen practically every film from Bill of Divorcement, Morning Glory, all the way up to Philadelphia Story in 35 millimeter. Okay.
Yeah.
So she sees on a big screen. Now, you were in London, L.A., New York, I don't know where.
That's fantastic.
But suddenly, as you can see behind the eyes, you're right. You see.
And also to see the camera moves. I mean, let's face it. I mean, I don't think, watching them on the small screen, that I'd ever appreciated the direction in those films. And also her transformation, because she's so known for, her vocal quality, and so. But she did transform. Alice Adams was so heartbreaking.
Alice Adams is brilliant. Yeah.
Heartbreaking. But then Spitfire. I mean, she had some very noble, brave failures. This Arkansas Hellcat.
Back to the risk that you take. How do you go? Here's someone whose voice was known.
Yeah.
What's the line you want to make sure you approach but don't go over? Is it, or anything like that, in terms of somebody in which has such a distinctive voice? Are you trying to capture it exactly, or is it part of her so that you have got to reflect it because it is so defining about her?
If she'd been a theatre actor, I think it would have been different because I would be portraying her in a different medium. But portraying her in the same medium in which she's so iconically known, I think you have to give a nod to her screen persona. Even though there's never moments of me playing Hepburn in a Philadelphia Story.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that whole first scene in the film, she comes in, almost like in a screwball comedy that she made with Grant. She comes in and just talks her way through the whole of the first scene. So even though it's not naturalistic, you have to give a nod in that direction. But at the end of the day, no one wants to see anyone's homework. So you have to find a way to kind of become go through mimicry into habitation, I think, and hopefully I've done that. But it's a really difficult line to walk.
I think you have. What was the role of Leonardo in this? I mean, he was obsessed. He liked Hughes, was interested in Hughes.
He apparently was developing it with Michael Mann and John Logan on the script. And so when I read the script, I said I was really interested because it reveals so much about America and you know, the whole idea of aviation, the whole idea of the last frontier, really, too.
Right.
They're gone as far west as you can. The end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, they're creating the American dream continues. Only it's Hollywood and in the air. Yeah. You know, the beginning of the continuation of the empire. You know, it's going to go. And I found that fascinating. And I also found the seeds of destruction in him, in his own genes, in a sense, interesting.
Coming from his mother?
Apparently. I mean, apparently it's not what is called obsessional compulsive disorder or something. And apparently some people say it came from the mother's side and that sort of thing. It's not his fault. It happens to be there, you know, but he has to deal with it, and that's a price he has to pay.
And did he recognize it?
I don't know if
he doesn't ever talk about it. It's you see the manifestations of it.
You see manifestations,
but you don't see him talking about it. I mean, it's almost not even acknowledge it. Well, although he had to know.
He talks in the film. He talks to Cate about it. Sometimes he sees things. He says.
Yeah, he did say that.
Yeah, he gets really worried about that.
But it's interesting that's one of the few moments of self-reflection. He's so forward-moving that there's not a lot of time for mental repose, which is maybe part of the problem.
He was an extraordinarily handsome man, tall. You saw that. I mean, I saw today a short biography of him. You know, and when going down the ticker tape parade after he set the record. I mean, extraordinary. Was he 6'5"? How tall was he?
I think about 6'5". Yeah.
That's 6'5".
Yeah. No, and I think Leo carries it off beautifully in the Hell's Angels premiere. He's standing there in that in the tails and gleaming eyes, and you know, and he ages 20 years. And by the time that airplane crash in 1946-47 in Beverly Hills,
I couldn't believe he survived.
He survived it. Yeah, they worked it out.
And how was he? But it affected him for the rest of his life.
Yes. Yeah.
And what happened there, other than the fact that he was terribly injured and had trouble walking? And
I think ultimately, what happened was, of course, you have to realize that was the fourth plane crash he had had. Yeah. That was the fourth, and there was a lot of damage to frontal lobe.
One in the beat plant.
Yeah, and there was another one on Hell's Angels, where it's referred to in the film. The beginning of the film says, "You can't do that, Howard. You can't take that plane and dive like that." He says, "It can be done. It can be done." In reality, he said, "I'll show you." And he got on the plane, and it hit the ground. He got out, and he said, "You're right. It can't be done." And there was one other plane crash in Lake Mead, which was a very dangerous one. 2 people lost in that. And I think the frontal lobe injury. Really added to it. I would think. I'm not a doctor, but I would
But is that part of the story? I mean, part of the fact that we assume about Howard Hughes that he had frontal lobe injury?
I mean, I would think, certainly from that plane crash, too. I mean, literally hitting his head against the canopy.
But are there a lot of people around? I mean, Terry Moore is alive.
Yes, yeah, we just saw her in Los Angeles.
Jean Peters is...
She's gone now, I think.
She's gone.
Yeah.
So you could talk to these people about what he was like.
Yes, that's
and what did they inform you about? I mean, what did they tell you?
Well, I mean, Terry was very... very generous, but sharing her thoughts and all the extraordinary telephone conversations he would have with her. In
the middle of the night?
Yeah, in the middle of the night, all the time. And she really worked with Leo on a lot of that. And little things like he would call... Hepburn, he called her country mouse and city mouse. They called each other. And for Terry Moore was pork chop. And, and that's what we try to put as much of that in there as possible in the picture. These are details that we were sort of accumulating. But Terry had seen the film, and she felt that Leo had done a very, very good job.
Captured the Hughes that she knew.
Captured him, and said, really, not only in the flying sequences, but also in... many other sequences she spelled.
Is that right?
Yeah.
But he was foremost, you believe, in his own heart, an aviator, or is that what he thought of himself most of all?
I think most of all an aviator. There's no
more
doubt
so
about
than
it. Yeah, I think ultimately the obsessions with film and women sort of just drifted away, And you know, really, I think the satisfaction of understanding flight stayed with him. I think that's the
because it was such a frontier thing at that time.
Yeah.
Was it Hepburn? He said you're only an actress. Who did he say that to in the film?
Yes, to Hepburn.
You're only a movie star.
You're only a movie star.
Yeah, but it's you're not an actress, and there's plenty of movie stars in Hollywood. And I think probably to call Hepburn that insult levelled at Hepburn would have really gone straight to her heart, because she was an interesting woman in many senses, but in the sense that I think she was always conflicted that it was a kind of a fluffy thing to do with one's life. That
to be an actress.
I don't know that her family really ever, ever really sort of respected her choice of profession.
She came back here to live pretty early, didn't she, or not?
She'd always come back here, you know,
to live in Connecticut.
Yeah, she was anchored here. It was sort of what seemed to anchor her, and there were many periods in her early career where she'd just retreat. You know.
What did you find out about the? Why did you decide to end the film when you did?
Well, again, this is part of the script,
right.
John Logan. It's one of the reasons I made the picture, because quite honestly, when he got into the battle with Juan Trippe at Pan Am, this is something I didn't know about very much. Well, it's interesting about how it reflects
control of air rights.
Control of air rights, and this is happening every day today too, in different ways. American business fighting the government fighting back, and all this sort of thing. And I found that fascinating to really battle it out on that level. And to actually, I found it when I first read it. I said I couldn't believe that he won the case. In a sense, it wasn't a lawsuit, but it was he won in the Senate. In a way, he got up and he left. I found that to be fascinating.
I did too.
And
at that point, you had Leonardo looking exactly like him.
Yes. Well, by that point, there's wonderful photography wonderful documentary footage of him, literally.
And what is that? He was holding that thing to his ear?
To hear better. To hear better.
Oh, that's right, because he was deaf from an early age.
Yeah. But also that he was able, right after that, to actually prove the point that the Hercules could fly, even if it was a minute. Yeah. It was airworthy. And I found that to be, I said, well, if it ends there, I said, I'm not that interested. But it takes one more step, and it ends with him recognizing that he's got a price to pay. Yeah. And he will pay for it the rest of his life, you know.
Yeah, he became obsessed with having Mormons work for him later.
Yeah.
And Bob Mayhew and other guys like that.
Yeah.
And he was a guy named Guy.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you ask a guy to do something and come in a room, say bring in the milk 10 times, and the guy does it, well, eventually, people will do it as long as they get paid. I mean,
where did that? Obviously, that was in the script, but where did that come from? Is that part of
memos?
That's
memos, tons of memos. I'd like to do a film just on.
Didn't he write a lot of stuff down?
Everything's been written down. I would love to do a film just on the memos
that Hughes wrote to all of his.
Yes. Oh yeah. 9 to 10 steps in opening a can of peaches.
What?
Yeah, that's
9 to 10 steps.
Yeah, that was later.
Oh,
this
like
is
step
later.
1, step 2,
well,
step 3.
This is how to lift the. You approach it trying to reach literally in the middle without trying to
And
then
you
you lift
days.
It can go days. You know, and very very interesting. Supportive. You have now opened the can of peaches. The next step is. And it go.
But
taking them
out.
He eventually sold TWA for $456 million.
Yeah.
But when he died, how much money was he worth? Do you know?
I don't really know. And I think what's interesting is that the Hughes Research Foundation, the health, that he created, is doing wonderful work now.
In terms of would cancer or do everything?
Everything, from what I understand. Yeah.
The idea. I mean, this is such fascinating for me. Is that here was a guy, who had so much power. I mean, he set out to he wanted to be the fastest man alive.
Mm-hmm. That's right. He wrote those things down.
Small ambitions.
Yeah.
fastest man, richest man, and there was something about Hollywood or women.
Make the biggest movies.
Make the biggest movies that he ever made. Was he any good as a movie maker?
I think he was.
Because the whole Jane Russell stuff is just.
The Outlaw doesn't. I don't know if the Outlaw itself holds up.
It sounds like marketing more than anything else.
Yeah, marketing, but also provocation. And also he was sort of like the outlaw of Hollywood. I mean, when he did Hell's Angels. My father talked about it, and one of the reasons I wanted to see it, both Hell's Angels and Scarface were films maudits, films that were spoken about as if he got away with something really difficult. And the sexuality in the scenes with Jean Harlow in Hell's Angels were the first time like that on the screen, really. And particularly Scarface may be the movie that finally brought the code down in Hollywood. Yeah. The idea of equating Tony Montana and his sister with the Borgias. Incestuous relationship. The violence in the film is extraordinary. Beautifully directed by Howard Hawks, by the way. Glossy film, beautiful, gorgeous looking. And I mean, the violence. When we looked at it the first time in the mid-'70s, we're looking at this picture, and we felt that it's terribly violent. Yet we kind of liked these characters, George Raft and Muni and everybody running around, and just for that very reason. the censor board would say these are people you shouldn't emulate. And we had a
Right.
similar thing later on in my own pictures in Goodfellas and that sort of thing, where people kind of enjoyed these characters. And I said, yeah, if you watch the last hour of the picture, they pay for it.
Yeah.
And so does Tony Montana. But he really pushed the edge that way, and I think he was, in a sense, like the outlaw of Hollywood.
When Hepburn continued to see him the rest of her life in terms of phone conversations?
They didn't actually have
until he
contact,
died. He died in
I
what,
don't
76?
think.
76.
Yeah. No, I think they just spoke on the phone. Their lives were in, very different dimensions. And also, I don't think he really saw anyone. He was a complete recluse by that stage.
Time, because of this obsessive disorder he had.
Yeah, and the fact that he's calling people at 3 a.m.
Although I know a lot of people in Hollywood do that.
Oh, yeah.
But Hepburn, gets up at the crack of dawn and breaks the ice and goes for a swim.
Goes for a swim. Yeah, that's I love him.
What were the biggest challenge in making this movie? Wasn't that your question?
The performances.
Mike, yes.
No, not the question. You said
the performances.
No, the
really.
worst scene.
The worst scene for me. Well, I mean, the greatest challenge was really dealing with the Hughes as a character through Leo and Katharine Hepburn and through Cate. And Cate Beckinsale is Ava Gardner. This was rather difficult, because of the very thing. And
I love the way Ava Gardner handled him, though. I mean,
I mean, she was like a guy with him. She just basically, I'm not going to take anything from you. And
she
you
was
can't
that way with
buy me.
Sinatra too.
Yeah, apparently, and that's one of the things. That's what I thought was so great what John did in the script, because he was with so many women. The only thing he could do is really concentrate on one, and that was Katharine Hepburn. Faith Demergue, Kelly Gardner plays her. She is sort of the young woman that he's going to create. And then Ava Gardner won't take anything from him, in a way. So it's really the one woman is Katharine Hepburn, and everything else resonates from that. Otherwise, you'd be making a 20-hour film
but
about the different women.
But it's great, because the structure of the screenplay, it makes those relationships incredibly reactive. Yeah. And there's so much potential in him in that relationship and at that point. And it's like there's a fork in the road, and then he just goes towards the darkness after that. So the relationship and even what you've done visually, it's so surreal by the end. Like suddenly you're inside Hughes's head. You know when he goes in and all the string and
the strings, yeah.
And so you think, is this real? Is it not real?
Yeah. See, that is what I think would be the big challenge. I mean, how do you know he had to go ahead?
But that's fun. That was the fun of it.
Being creative about showing that.
Yeah, the big challenge was, working with the actors and creating these personas with the actors. Really, they created in a way and helping and shaping.
Because you're dealing with real people.
Yeah, you're dealing with real people. But like with Cate, once she's onto it, I mean. Quite honestly, after 2 or 3 takes, I said, as a director, I said to myself, well, I have to say something. I have to say something. I mean, it's all good to me.
She expects me to say something.
Yeah, she expects me to say something, but I'm going to ruin it if I say something. And I go over, and sure enough, I may say something. And
do you really expect something? If he'd not said anything, you would have known you were doing it just perfect, and that was it, right?
Oh, no, I would have been deeply paranoid.
Was you really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You're saying he either doesn't like me or something's wrong here, or else?
No, it's just something. Like one take, I think. So is it just,
she would do
is
one
he bored?
take
I could hear him snoring.
Yeah, she's good. She's good. Yeah, no, she's great. She's great. Yeah, I mean, really, it was quite something. But we didn't go too many takes, maybe 10, 12.
Yeah.
14 the most, like in that scene with the, am I supposed to expect this after the marriage, that after the wedding, that scene, that's about it. We had a complicated Steadicam shot in there. But no, for me, the biggest, what was the most fun in terms of getting into the obsession. How does one detail the obsession? Exactly. What is the image of the insert? In other words, not just an insert, it's like this cup. Well, you can't take a shot of the cup. It'll be from my point of view. But if it's from my point of view, what is the emotional connection that this cup has to me? And I mean, but that really gets into the angle, that gets to the size of the frame. I mean, any director can tell you that, but I was thinking of it in editing terms, and literally, finally washing his hands and the whole thing, getting to the doorknob, and he can't touch the doorknob in the bathroom.
And so he waits until somebody opens the door.
Until he waits, yeah. But it's a matter of how the hand is shown, what's in the rest of the frame, an angle looking down. Onto his head, which is really an old Hitchcock trick, which is the old obsession angle, the old guilt angle. Yeah.
It's called the guilt angle.
Yes, it's the guilt angle. Yeah.
And what's the psychology behind it?
I don't know, but you could feel somebody's lying when you shoot them that way. If they make go look at Hitchcock's Topaz. There's a scene where a guy is a famous scientist escapes from Eastern Bloc country to Washington, defects, and they're debriefing him in a house. And they're asking him some questions, and it's shot normally. He's answering, and then one guy says, "Did you ever hear the name Topaz?" And it cuts, and it's above, and he goes, "No, I haven't." You know he's lying.
So the shot indicates he's lying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it gives the audience may not know that, but they feel something is wrong. They feel something is off with the character.
Here's my question for you: working with this guy, just think about what we just listened to.
Put your fingers in your ears.
Just listen to what we just said. I mean, this is a walking, talking encyclopedia of every movie that's ever been made.
Well,
you know, and a guy who...
I think
see, you know what is so...
mid-30s to...
But no, but...
Mid-30s to...
No, you're...
80, maybe.
80,
yeah.
really?
You're unique,
Not much after
truly.
80. He really is unique, and my question is whether, I mean, if you're working with him, is there this constant dialogue about movies? And movies and the history of movies and movies that influence him and movies, have you seen this and that reminds me of this?
There was a strange moment when we were doing the screening room sequence and we were all talking, you and Leo and I were talking about something and you said, close the door. And we were talking and I realised that we'd been talking about films and the connection and in relation to the screening room and spinning off in our conversation for about an hour. And then I realised Marty had actually trapped us and locked us inside a screening room in exactly the same way that Hughes had locked himself in the screening room. I thought, we could be here for a week. I'm getting hungry.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. No, but the thing is, we really got into it. It's really about references. It's really about reference and saying, it reminds me, like, for example, the cuts I'm talking to you about is really, I mean, I can point to a film called The Wrong Man. Right. Directed by Hitchcock, in which Henry Fonda is based on a true story, in which he's a bass player at the Stork Club. He's arrested because a guy in Queens happened to look like him, who happened to rob an insurance office, and he's put into jail finally. And it's the way Fonda moves and the way he sits in the jail cell when he's finally locked away in the process of humiliation, taking the fingerprints and everything, just the intercutting of the inserts. And his point of view of the inserts, sitting in the jail cell, looking at the ceiling, cut to the ceiling, cut back to Fonda. He looks, cut to a sink, cut back to Fonda. He looks at the bars and the lock, cut to the bars and lock, cut back to Fonda. Now the Fonda shots are pretty stationary, and it's all him, you know. But why those angles, and why that rhythm in the cutting? Because you just don't shoot the ceiling. You try to just shoot the ceiling. You can't. You've got to figure out what makes that ceiling special to him. What is the emotional intent of that image?
See, I also that's what, in answer to your question, that's what makes you remarkable. I think is that you process all these really specific observations, filter them through you, and they're not in any way dry. It's not some library of knowledge which, say, a few people might have. You filter them through, you make them specifically yours, and connect deeply and emotionally and psychologically with an audience, and also at the same time love actors.
Yeah, I agree.
There's a lot of directors who love film, but they don't necessarily like actors.
These guys are. I couldn't resist showing them these films. Charlie, I actually showed to all the cast. I showed a 35mm print of His Girl Friday, which
that was great.
Which I mean, just rhythm alone, okay?
Yes,
just Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell. Come on.
But I mean, I really, you have reinvigorated my understanding of Grant's genius. I mean, I think he was amazing actor.
Now, why was he a genius?
I just think he's really underrated. Yeah. His sense of style he's a remarkably acute in his understanding of the style of the film that he's in, and the difference between him and Philadelphia Story to His Girl Friday. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, no, he's remarkable.
If I ask, or if Kate would ask, tell me the 10 films that have influenced you the most, what would you say? Well, name me 7 out of the 10.
I mean, you go to,
It changes.
It changes somewhat. I mean, there's some basic ones. I really liked John Ford's The Searchers when I first saw it for many years.
I still love that.
Yeah, it's beautiful, especially if you see it on a big screen. Part of that whole film was VistaVision, really. Poetic film, beautiful poetry in the film, visual and language, too. Wells' Citizen Kane, Fellini's 8½, On the Waterfront, The Red Shoes, Visconti's film Senso and the Leopard, going all the way to Cassavetes and Shadows, and Renoir's The River. These are films right around that formative period for me, late 40s all the way up to 56, 57. By the time Cassavetes did Shadows, you just couldn't say to yourself, well, I want to make a film, but I don't have the equipment. You couldn't have an excuse anymore. You just had to pick up the camera, and if you had something to say, if you had some sort of passion, or you had some sort of, you wanted to express yourself somehow, and if you could figure out how to do it through the visual medium, with actors, from Kazan to Cassavetes, this was the big deal for me. And yet, keeping in mind, too, because when I saw Waterfront and Shadows, of course, different years, a number of years apart, but they broke the wall of the Hollywood style of acting, yet the Hollywood style of acting, from the Golden Age particularly, that we saw, has its own truth and its own codification. And once you understood that this is a code for a certain feeling, that whole business of the post-war musicals, which always had a dark side to them in the post-war. They got darker, culminating in Star is Born, which was, you could say, well, it was the first one was made in the early 30s, but not like what George Cukor and Judy Garland and James Mason sequence, and what they did in that film. Extremely troubling about creativity in a couple. Two creative people not being able to get along, and the competition between the two. And this was fascinating.
You and I once talked about Fellini after he died. You remember that? It was one of my favorite interviews we ever did. And did you teach a course or something, or do a Channel 13 or AFI
I did a documentary.
Or
I did a documentary on Italian cinema from neorealist period to about 1968. I'm actually going to do part 2 soon. And myself and Raphael Donato and Thelma Schoonmaker and Ken Jones and all of us. But basically it's about my relationship to Italian cinema, because I grew up in Queens at first, before we came back to Elizabeth Street. And in 1945 and 46, they had shown on TV, on every Friday night, they would show an Italian film with subtitles. And at the age of 5 or 6, I saw Open City, I saw Paisan, I saw Bicycle Thief, I saw these extraordinary Shoe Shine. And I saw, seeing the films is one thing, but seeing your family and your grandparents who don't speak English, they're speaking the same language these people are speaking. This is my family. This is my world. I'm 5 years old.
Is that how you learned to read?
Well, yeah, basically, yeah. And, they were telling me what was going on. But the thing was that they were reacting. In other words, I knew that I didn't quite belong completely in this place. I belonged in that place there that's all rubble now, and these people being going through the human condition down to its basic level of just survival. And I knew that this affected us deeply, and that had a certain kind of truth to it. That doesn't mean that having seen the certain Western films or certain noirs or certain Hollywood films that didn't have its own truth. I realized that later. But I had the two sort of clashing, and I guess I never quite settled between the two, I'm afraid.
Is there anything you've ever wanted to make you haven't,
Well, I'm still talking about that thing we mentioned last time when I was on the show about we're still not talking about it. We're working on the script now, and hopefully we're getting close to it. And it's a picture based on a book by Endo, a Japanese author called Silence, about two Portuguese priests going back to the 17th century with the persecution of the Christians in Japan. And
is there a nun in it?
Do you have an actress? Do you have an actress?
I was going to say, it's too bad. It's too bad.
Would you need to see a script before you would say yes?
I'd make a good one.
I can see that. Are you going to do Elizabeth again?
Oh, I think they're talking about it. I think they've been talking about it for years. Well, how would they release it in America? They couldn't call it Elizabeth II.
No.
No, I mean, it's one of those things where if it was made, I think it should be about Raleigh and that Elizabeth, because I think where the Elizabeth that we made ended, it ended in such a still point dramatically that you'd have to, I don't think that she could be the central protagonist of the film. So it's a matter of trying to get the script right, and you don't want to make something again just because you can. It's like each of the Godfather films was made for a really integral reason unto itself. And I think that if you, not that Elizabeth is the Godfather, but I think it's really important to find the reason for making it. So whether they do or not, I don't know.
Is she as fascinating a person as you? She's obviously. There's nobody more interesting than her. All the characters you have done.
I found. I think probably that. I mean, I found when I played Veronica Guerin, that was a.
Yeah, Veronica Guerin was a journalist who was assassinated. Right?
Yeah, but I mean, the challenge of playing Hepburn, even though she's not the, this film is not about her, the actual technical challenge of doing it, I think, was probably the most difficult thing I've ever had to do, because having to break down the preconceptions and the expectations and the trying to find the sort of the balance of taste, really, frankly, so that it's not some sort of burlesque, has that fine line. It was a really delicate thing. Whereas Elizabeth, it was such a, I mean, there's so much to draw on, but we don't know her in the same way. We don't viscerally understand her in the same way that we think we understand Hepburn.
Al was here the other night talking about Merchant of Venice. He was, for a guy who hardly ever does television, it was as brilliant a performance, a conversation on the part of the actor as I've ever seen. It was unbelievable. The whole
He's been gripped by that, though.
Yeah, he has. And maybe that's part of it. It was unbelievable, I mean, and we could have gone for another hour because of the fact that he got so
Oh, that's great.
Involved in it. Some have said about you that this may be the last, because you have small projects you want to do.
Yeah.
The last big budget movie
I think,
you do.
it just turned into one of these, I mean, quite honestly, to say a difficult film to make. Yes, it was. I must say, though, we did it on schedule. We stumbled until we fell and we were on schedule.
Yeah.
You know, we looked up and everything with the dust was flying.
I mean, this looked to me like a movie that would have cost a lot of money to make.
Yeah, it did, and I think even a little more than Gangs. Quite honestly, I think it's bigger than Gangs. But I was very well prepared. The script was very tight. A wonderful script by Logan, and so I designed. Basically, I was also very much attracted to recreating Hollywood of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and the aviation, the flying action sequences, working with digital and working with green screen and that sort of thing, really make something visceral in those scenes. And so ultimately, though, I don't know how much further I could go with the size of this kind of budget, let's say, with characters or stories that have an edge to them that keeps me interested. These two characters with Hughes and Hepburn, that for me was, I was just taken by the whole thing, and also by the
exploration
that darker
of the subject,
side. The darker side of him, because it wasn't his fault. I mean, literally. I mean, he was just cursed in a way, like an ancient Greek.
That was the myth. It was a tragedy of it all.
Yeah.
Here was this guy with all this remarkable intelligence and the inability to accept no.
Yeah. Oh,
I mean, the stunning. Just that great scene where he's feeling the plane.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's it. Yeah.
The whole
Every
sense.
man's fantasy.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a woman's back into
Sorry, we had to. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, we had to
I
do
remember
it.
that was one of my first days. Stroke her back, and then it's going to move into the plane.
In the plane.
I knew my place instantly.
So, no, the hand's got to be here. We have to go. Make it a little lower. No, a little higher. That sort of thing. But no, there was no doubt. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me, the next picture, a little more scaled down, I just don't know if the budget would be there for the kind of picture I want to make that takes more risks, let's say. And for me, this is just a very happy accident, in a way, for me to have worked on this film.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you here. Thank you, Kate.
My pleasure.